Hi, this is Anita, the Global Trade Gal. Today I want to talk a little bit about ethical sourcing and exactly what does ethical sourcing mean. Right now in the global supply chain, there's a lot of these sort of like buzzwords. And one of the buzzwords that's out there is ethical sourcing or ethical manufacturing. And what exactly does ethical manufacturing mean? And why ethical factoring can matter? Well, ethical manufacturing home decor can ensure fair labor practices. In other words, but when we talk about fair labor practices, it doesn't mean that fair labor or the price that's the cost that somebody earns per hour in a country like the United States or Europe needs to be the same as somebody, let's say, in India or Vietnam or even China. It means that somebody has a safe and clean working environment. The manufacturer can support some type of environmentally sustainable production, promotes community well-being. When you go into a lot of these factories in Asia, you might look at some of these ladies that are there, weaving or doing other types of work. And there might be some people say like, oh, I feel so sorry for them, how terrible that they need to do this. But for them, it might be, wow, I love being here because I have a community. This is sort of like my community. And they, sometimes they're doing production and other things. And they're sitting around, they're talking and maybe gossiping or, other things like other people would do maybe in, another type of factories. And for them, this could be their community. This could be their place where they feel they belong. It could be, a factories that uphold strong governance and compliance standards. So all that has to do with ethical sourcing. And you might ask, well, why does ethical sourcing matter? Let's talk about what it means to be unethical. Unethical practices could mean that somebody's working in an unsafe working environment. Unfair wages or exploitative labor, child labor or forced labor, and environmental pollution and waste. Now, I can say that we, in all of our factories, check and make sure there is no child labor, no exploitative labor, or no slave labor. And, today in Asia, I really don't see that in most of the good factories, at least at the factories at the level that we work at in home decor and home furnishing. Part of it could be that we're working in a medium to high-end industry. And so because of that, price is important, yes, but quality is also very important. And so since quality is something that's very important to us, that means that we have to have labor or we have to have people who know what they're doing, basically. That if I'm going to have somebody doing finishing, I need somebody who knows how to finish a product. And that will not be a child or that will not be a slave labor. So a lot of the factories that you go in Asia today, I at least have not found this with, child or slave or exploitative labor going on, because a lot of the factories require somebody with some skill. They need people that have the skills that they require, especially in today's world of manufacturing where machineries are taking over more and more manufacturing. They need people who know how to run the machineries. They need people that can be safe around the machineries. They want to ensure that their production is going to continue. Where I think you find a lot of the exploitative or unethical labor is in areas or places where price is extremely sensitive, where somebody has, knocked down the price so low on an item because they need to buy it so cheap that the only way that the manufacturer can really make it work is through using this type of labor. Maybe I believe in a good world that doesn't exist, but I believe that a lot of the managers of the factories, they want people working in their factories where they're not going to have problems, because they don't want to have problems with their production. Whenever you have problems with your production, it kills a factory or kills the manufacturing. So they want to have the labor in there that knows exactly what they're doing. They don't want to have the people in there who don't know what they're doing or who are going to not be efficient, not be effective. They essentially do not want people in there who are going to mess up their production, cost them money, and cause problems. So you might ask, well, how do we, my company, Mondoro, how do we assume that the factories we work with are basically using ethical manufacturing practices? At Mondoro, in case you haven't been listening, we are specialized in home decor and home furnishing. The first thing we do is we conduct on-site inspections. My team and I are in the factories. We are actively in the factories checking production. It is just part of what we do. We, a lot of times, for many of our products, we may even inspect, 100%, check everything because of the fact that we're medium to high end. We need to make sure what goes out is correct. We maintain open dialogue with the workers. We talk directly to the workers. We know many of the workers. We know who they are. We talk to them. In fact, when we have a lunch break, my inspector and others might be over there smoking a cigarette and playing chess with the workers. So, they know the workers on a friendly basis, so they know what is going on. We have our factories and others understand that we prohibit child labor or forced labor on all of the operations that we work with, and they all understand that. We make sure there's a safe working environment, and we try to encourage any manufacturers we work with, whether it's sub-manufacturers, vendors, others, to be environmentally conscious wherever possible. And I should say that now in Asia, especially in countries like China, Vietnam, and other places, the environment has become a huge issue. In fact, if you go to China and you even come to Vietnam, there's a lot of electric vehicles here. Electric vehicles more than probably, in places like the United States. The reason is because pollution is bad. They understand the pollution is bad. So the government cracks down on environmental issues because they know that this is a problem that they need to have to deal with. Ethical sourcing doesn't stop just at the factory gate. We believe in contributing to community. And wherever we can, we try to contribute to the factory, the community, and work together with the factory through charitable and other type of organizations. Ethical doesn't have to necessarily mean expensive, and that's one of the things but for us, it means that a quality product. And as I mentioned before, that really most manufacturers need to have skilled people in their factories, especially those that are dealing with medium to higher end. And as I've said before, and I'll repeat it again, the main problem is when that happens with child or forced or other labor is where somebody's going in and saying to somebody, a factory says, well, I can only produce this for, let's say, $3, and then the company's saying, well, I can only buy it for $1.50, so you do whatever you need to do. And then the factory gets greedy, they get hungry, they want to take the order, maybe it's a really large order, and so then they resort to some unethical practices. And I point this out because a lot of times these problems is on the buyer as well as the supplier. In other words, if the buyer is pressing the supplier for something which is unreasonable and just cannot be done, and then the supplier gets greedy because they really want to have that business, then they resort to unethical practices. I've written a blog post on this, and it's called, What is Ethical Home Decor Manufacturing? Put a link in the description. We welcome you to be able to read this and to understand more about this. To also understand that, really, when it comes to ethical or unethical, or when we talk about things like child labor, you can't really all the time just put the blame exactly on to the supplier, because a lot of times, as I mentioned before, it could be the buyer making unreasonable demands. And I say this because of the fact that I have seen this myself in Asia, or heard about this myself in Asia, where somebody has put a demand upon a supplier that they just couldn't do because it was just completely unreasonable. But then they got greedy and said, well, look, if I get slave or prison or child labor, then I can be able to do it. But if you're dealing like we are in medium to higher end, we need to have skilled workers because of the fact that we do not want to have quality issues. So we ensure that we have skilled workers in there can do the quality of the product we require. This is Anita from Global Trade Gal. Thank you so much for listening. We hope that this is giving you a kind of a bit of a different perspective on ethical sourcing and some of the issues of maybe just the global supply chain itself. If you've enjoyed this, we hope that you'll subscribe and that you'll leave us a rating, give us a thumbs up. We'd love to have you be part of our community because we appreciate you, our listeners.